Most Podern Podcast, Season 3, Episode 3. Please welcome the authors of the forthcoming book, Value of Design, Creating Agency Through Data-Driven Insights.
We make design decisions or other financial decisions based on what we know in the past has been successful. And I think one of the key arguments we have in this book is, design sometimes is sidelined, or it's kind of this nice to have but not a must have in the past because it didn't have evidence, right? So what we're trying to do here is, by creating this research, try to have more, power given back to the designer at the negotiations table.
Well, welcome back to Most Podern with another episode. Of course, this season we're looking at research and understanding how we can think about the built environment in ways that will impact how that same place is shaped. We have a special episode this time. We actually have 3 guests, although it's a little bit in between. We have sort of a hybrid guest because Minkoo is joining us as a panelist this time. But we have with us Helena Rong and Tony Yang. Helena is a PhD student at Columbia University, and Tony is a Doctor of Design student at Harvard University. And together with Minkoo, our colleague and our host, they've been working on a research project called The Value of Design, which really tries to quantify how design is perceived in terms of its value, in terms of its opportunities, in terms of how it can be provide something for society, which is I think a really wide open question and a very fascinating one for you guys to take on. So thank you guys for joining us. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having us.
And of course, we're joined as well with our co-host, Limo Lee. So I think it might be nice to start with each of you sort of giving us a little bit of your background and telling us, hopefully merging and finding out how you all came together to work on this project. So maybe we'll start with you, Helena.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Alex, for that introduction. As you've mentioned, I'm currently doing my PhD at Columbia, where I study urban planning and its intersection with technologies. So I'm actually looking at blockchains right now and see how, it's been used in urban governance and kind of create all these new mechanisms for people to make decisions together. And so initially, I came from an architecture background, and I did my master's at MIT, where I met Minkoo and Tony. And funny enough, all 3 of us actually worked at the same firm before. We all worked for OMA in various different locations. So that was kind of like a bonding moment when we met each other. But I think another thing that brought us together is our, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but maybe this would also resonate with you too, is this frustration with architecture at first, thinking that, at school, we design, we learn how to design buildings, we learn about forms, we learn about the potential value, which is kind of this really ambiguous word, which we'll unpack much further later today. And essentially what we learn in school and what actually is happening in the real world, there seems to be this great mismatch. So yeah, for me, I kind of, we're interested in studying kind of design from other angles, whether it's from real estate or from urban planning, in order to understand its role in the broader society, which I feel like I'm talking a little bit too much now. So I'm going to hand over to the others for intros, but we'll come back to this.
Yeah, Tony, did you work with Helena at OMA?
No, we were at different offices. I think Helena was in the Rotterdam office. I was mostly in Hong Kong. But same. So that also revealed my background. I also studied architecture for my undergrad, and we all met at MIT. We all joined the MIT REST, the innovation lab, where we build upon our curiosity of data, and also our a little bit dissatisfaction with design. So that's how we started the Value of Design project. But now I'm doing different research on mostly in urban planning, but also related to policy and urban governance in emergence of new technology.
And so this is an ongoing project. How long, Minkoo, have you guys been working on this?
Since 2018, I think. And by the way, what's wrong with OMA people? Why are they poking around?
I'm in that camp too, so.
Yeah, right. When did you work at OMA, Alex?
2014 to 2016 in New York. A lot of valuable design being produced at that time.
I bet. Yeah, so we started this research in 2018, I believe. And back then, I started working with the lab director, Dr. Andrea Shigu, who sadly passed, unfortunately. She had this various interest in the design realm, like how architects work, how does the creative process work when designing these like skyscrapers and the city skylines. So we just had a coffee. We talked about like how my experience was working at OMA, like designing these towers, and then how her interest overlaps. She was actually an econometrician, so she comes from the macroeconomics analysis side, trying to understand the world's behavior through numbers. And we had this overlap thinking like, does design even have any effect on real estate value? And that's how I joined the lab and actually started writing my thesis on whether famous architects who won like Pritzker prizes, these like prestigious awards, does their design have any actual monetary value coming to, office towers in Manhattan?
It's an interesting. I mean, it's not surprising, kind of having known a little bit about your background and shared with me too. It's a moment when not just OMA, but a lot of famous firms were working on big development projects, basically hired for that exact reason, to bring in the big name, to promote the luxury tower or the office building or the mixed use development. So I think it has something to do with the timing too, kind of mid 20 teens. But also, obviously, also the timing of our careers where we started to think, and you guys especially started to think, is this sustainable, or what is the purpose? What is the kind of mechanism happening here? I kind of want to ask Helena and Tony, since obviously Minkoo is practicing in real estate, but you two have dedicated yourselves now to research in particular. How would you describe spatial research, and how do you feel like it should be valued within the disciplines that you're engaging with?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I think that's a really great question, because I think when we talk about spatial research, sometimes people immediately think of, like spatial GIS, mapping and stuff like that. And while that's really important, I think for me, like what I've always been really interested in is to see space as essentially like a stage where lived experience takes place. It's where like social interactions happen. It's where like people work together, live and play. So it's really this, really versatile stage and container for a lot of things to happen, whether it's a building or a city. I think there's really something about space that affects the way that social interactions happen. Like kind of the space and the social world are like entangled in a way. So, and kind of, like my own experience working as an architect before doing all of this research shenanigans has been, like how do people actually use the space, right? Like I've always been interested in like participatory practices and kind of like decision makings that's happening either before a building is designed or after it's constructed, to see how like different groups of people use the space, and whether there's any, like discrepancies between how a space is initially designed versus it's actually used. So I feel like all these, threads of my interest, whether it was from practicing an architect or later on, developed as a researcher, is all kind of coming together as one cohesive like line of interest, I would say.
I want to follow up on that, because the interaction part in the urban context today also applies to, let's say, inter-organizational relationships, because my research focuses more on the urban governance side, but also, so it's a little bit more related to public administration, for example. So in that case, how different departments collaborate, how different organizations, public and the private, collaborate, are all fall into that category. But then there's usually in social science research, the spatial component is not considered, while all these interactions actually had more or less consider, let's say, activities happens in the urban space, or space is actually one of the studied subjects. So somehow people, maybe they're not, so this kind of urban planning and also architect's perspective actually contributes to this study, for sure.
Yeah, it's sort of where everything winds up, right? Like all the research that we do in these other fields, they all have to play out somewhere. Obviously, primarily in the physical environment, although maybe that's coming into question with new advances in technology. But okay, so now that that's clear, I want to dig into the project itself, because to me it's very interesting. It's always been something that I've been wondering about. And I'm really glad that I actually knew you guys before you started the work. So it's really interesting to see you progress it and move it forward. But maybe we can start off by going around the team and defining for yourselves how you perceive design value, and then how did you coalesce to come together and create at least one clearer or broader definition that you could then to propel the work forward.
Yeah, so I think the value of design, like the title of the book, is something that's really, could be interpreted differently by anyone who is trying to assign a definition to it. But I think for us, we kind of met at the Real Estate Innovation Lab, and we were working there on this project together as a team with our, former lab director, Andrea Shigud. And I think for us, there's this notion of bridging between design and finance, and bridging between kind of architecture and economics. And I feel like, real estate innovation in itself is somewhat of an oxymoron, because believe it or not, like real estate is such an old profession that we know, practicing developers have had all the experience that they know has worked in the past, right? So there's not really any incentives in the past to innovate and introduce technologies or methods that haven't been really tested before. But I think for us, what we see, because we kind of come from different disciplines, especially Andrea, she had a financial a finance and economics background, whereas the three of us all came from architecture. When we began to work together, we realized, oh, there's actually this gap between these disciplines because of the lack of common language or lack of communication. We actually don't really understand one another, even though we both claim to have some kind of impact on the built environment, right? Because architects design the buildings and developers are the ones who are putting down money to construct the buildings. And so we see, the word value is essentially, in this context, is tied to financial value, right? Because we're measuring how much a building has been transacted or rented for. But actually, we see kind of financial value as in some ways a proxy for other types of values, whether it's social values or cultural values. And because these things are even less, easy to be quantified, we feel that because financial value is something that practitioners from other fields in real estate and etc. are already measuring, right? But behind the scenes, behind each transaction, there's kind of negotiation and decision making between a buyer and seller, between a landlord and the renter, that we think that by studying financial value, we can actually gain insights into other types of value. And so this is why financial value is something that we're paying attention to. By bringing in the lens of design, we're essentially trying to bridge this gap between design and finance.
Is that where Minkoo and Tony, is that where you were coming from as well? You guys kind of were united at the beginning?
I wouldn't say. Well, it was actually a coin. I want to add one funny story. Is actually to some degree it's kind of like coincidence. It was, I think, the whole inspiration sparked from a conversation between Helena. I think I would give credit to Helena and Andrea in the beginning. They had this conversation about where is design positioned in this kind of financial evaluation process in real estate. So I think that was kind of a very interesting coincidental point. But at the same time, I think we were at the moment at MIT where the school actually advocates so strongly about this kind of interdisciplinary research. And so there was this kind of strange rumor of calling, say, the infinite corridor of MIT brings the opportunity for different departments to meet and then to communicate. Well, I would put a question mark on that. At least for the corridors that we walked through, it was not really a straight and also very easy accessible corridor. But somehow we were glad that a conversation that came up. Then we started this whole journey.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was, I would add a personal perspective there. I just wanted to make sense of what I was doing as a designer, and also wanted to see, well, I wouldn't say proof, but just try to see to myself, like, what type of value it added, if it added anything. And in fact, it was telling me some positive signs, the research results.
Yeah, so I guess maybe to set the stage for our listeners, I think all of us kind of come from a similar background. We all inherently feel that design is valuable, but why is it important for you guys that design is valuable? Like, why is this question important to ask?
I would give a quick thought on that, because I think design is valuable because that's something we all have, this kind of, at least we would say, hypothesis. We have this kind of understanding. But the thing is, we never made this understanding or this kind of connection between design and evaluation. We never made this connection so explicit. So at least we would say our work made a small attempt to reveal that connection. And why that is important, that I would say, that's actually a great question, but I would say that actually brings more design to the front of the stage. So now people actually has a better understanding seeing design, rather than say, oh, that's just a tool or a technique to generate certain aesthetics in catering to certain group of people's taste. No, it's not. Design has some intrinsic values in today's society, and we want to discover that, and we want to put that into a context where people can appreciate it from different perspectives. And that's how also design probably has more opportunity to engage in conversations to more concerning socioeconomic topics.
Well, I think latent to some of what you guys are already saying is that design isn't really valued right now, or as much as it should be. And maybe you're trying to unlock the potential for it to be more valuable. So can you maybe explain to our listeners what is valued in a building at the moment? How do we assess value for a building? How do buildings play a role in larger economic structures? Things of that nature.
So in terms of monetary value, in terms of property value, the buildings are basically measured on their revenue, on their size of revenue, and based on their location, and based on the typical buildings that are comparable within a certain range of area. Meaning, if, let's say, building A and building B is in the city, it's within the block. Building A was sold by $100. Building B, if it has a same size, same floor plate, very similar, then it will probably sell at $100 or a little bit more, right? So that's the basic thinking, if they are making the same revenue. But if one building is making more revenue by having more, let's say if it's a residential unit, more number of units, or if it's making more rent because it's better designed, then that is an added premium to the value of the building. So that's basically how commercial real estate gets evaluated on very simple terms.
So it really has very little to do with the actual aesthetics of the building. It more has to do with the financial performance of the asset, right?
Well, kind of, but what we're questioning is it really just the numbers?
Yeah.
Because if you see a building, let's say, again, the building A and B, if one building is clearly more comfortable and you prefer it on an actual experiential level, then if they charge the same rent, let's say, would you choose a better designed or or more comfortable building versus kind of a compromised building? You would go for a better designed building, right? So I think it's common sense.
Yeah, but I think one thing that I'm curious about too is the fact that most people who actually consume buildings, who buy into or invest buildings, a lot of them don't actually use the building. For instance, the REIT, the Real Estate Investment Trust, that's a financial asset that collects together a bunch of properties and then becomes a financial product, that gets traded, that gets reevaluated. So the actual performance of the building with regards to the REIT has zero to do directly, with the aesthetics. Although what you're saying, Minkoo, is that obviously down the line, kind of much more elongated distribution of value, is, there is some component of aesthetics and of look and design that actually impacts the performance of the product.
Yeah, but what we're trying to question is, isn't it because there is no data point to measure these type of performances about comfortness? Because again, I believe it's related to basic human common sense. If you have a comfortable building, you want to live there. You want to spend time there. But currently, you would be surprised the way that a building gets included in a data set. There's only a few factors: the number of stories, the size of the building, and maybe what the overall cladding is. Is it brick? Is it concrete? Is it steel? That's pretty much it. So how can you measure the whole complexity of design with only those three features? Oh, maybe one more. When was it built? How can you measure design with only those four features, 4 data points? So we're trying to see and question that by exploring and trying to add more data points by utilizing the current technologies out there.
I think maybe something you can help us understand is when you guys talk about the value of design, you're talking about within your research a very specific type of building. And with that specific type of building, there's these standard data points that they use in order to build out how valuable this building is as like a financial instrument. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about why that is? Why is it valued on so few factors? And what are the additional factors that you guys are looking at in order to maybe add more nuance and more complexity into this valuation?
So for our research, we look at like commercial buildings and especially like offices. And we look at it in the context of New York, Manhattan to be specific. And the reason why we are looking at commercial buildings instead of the other ones is actually because of the limitation of data. It happens so that we have this data set from our partners that tracks, like 20 years of his transaction and rental history for every single office building in New York City. And that's like a pretty kind of massive scale if we think about it, right? Like we are able to see like the temporal changes of a very kind of comprehensive set of data points within a confined geographical area, which we can define as our like boundary of study. And so this is why we're like, looking at commercial buildings instead of the other types. And I think the other question you were asking is how come the other factors were not taken into consideration, especially having to do with design, and why is it that we only consider like what Minkoo has talked about, the very raw aspects, which are they're physical features of a building, but we can't really call them design because there's no like design thinking or thoughts that goes on behind there. And the reason why is because design kind of happens in isolation within single architect's offices. And then the types of, data, if we may call it, like plans, sections, like models, they're all living in isolation as well. And there, hasn't been really an attempt in the past to collect that data or to understand it at a scale where we can actually make really generalizable knowledge about them. So what we are trying to do here is actually, now we have more advanced reality capturing technologies that, New York City, for instance, actually has really detailed models of the entire city. So we know what each building roughly looks like from the external, the exterior of a building essentially. And this is the first step that we can actually as a whole, like looking at buildings or commercial buildings in this case, and compare apples to apple, right? Like we don't necessarily have to rely on like plans or sections and ask, every single offices to give that to us because that's not really feasible. But at least we can start with what we call like a low-hanging fruit, which is looking at, for example, the external geometries, where design to some extent, there's like features that are captured or included, which we can already pick up. So this is where we started to create our own design data catalog. And essentially, within that, the data set that we're working with, which I mentioned is containing all the transaction data across the past 20 years, we're in addition to that, like tagging along like features of the building exteriors to begin to measure design. And this is what, kind of the goal of the project is also to build out that data set because it currently doesn't exist. And because if it's non-existent, that's why it's not measured. And because it's not measured, that's why we don't understand it, right? So it kind of backtracks to the whole root of the problem. And we're trying to work backwards by building the data and then analyzing what effect it has on value. And in this case, like transaction and rental prices as a proxy of other types of values.
So the backbone of the research is basically this merger of a 20-year data set on real estate transaction with quite an extensive Rhino model by geotagging those locational transactional information to building by building.
A 3D,
So that serves
3D model.
3D model with an actual address on the longitude and latitude, and geotag every single data point related to that transactional data. So I guess it's so-called digital twinning, right? So we have done that since 2017.
Well, it's interesting because usually when I think about GIS, so global geographic information systems, so digital mapping, I mostly think about top-down 2D. Okay, in plan, this point has this data set that has this feature, it has this characteristic. But what you're doing is you're expanding that to the third dimension. And I guess as you had mentioned, Helena, you're looking at certain features of the vertical axis in addition to the horizontal planes that give you potentially some additional value. Well, I guess the next question becomes, what did you find when you established that, when you created this data set? And how did you, was there anything that was unexpected, or were there things that you actually intuitively understood? Were there surprises, or was it kind of what you had thought would be the case?
Well, fun fact, what I was doing as a designer had some value, I guess.
That's because
the awarded designers, awarded architects, their design buildings actually transacted with a 23% premium when you compare similar type of office towers nearby. So that was a great start. And then that allowed us to question even bigger questions and try to think about, okay, then before that, like this wasn't the first study who has done a research like this. There were a few more examples, but then the interpretation of the result was heavily leaning on the marketing power of these famous architects. But I mean, by working at those offices, it's not only about a single genius, right? There are many thoughts and many ideas behind these projects that I believe is more than just a name of the architect. So I think we shared that same idea, and then we tried to detail it in a way that, okay, like is it a physical feature? And that's where Helena started her research.
Yeah, it's kind of like we, initially kind of attribute the word design by associating with designers, right? Because designers design, right? But what do they actually design? Like, what are if we can break it down into like features or metrics, what are they, right? Because, we were inspired also by, OMA had the elements of architecture. And I think Francis Ching also was trying to like break down like architecture into components. And we had that same idea of essentially breaking down design into measurable features or things that we can, either physically or performatively describe independently. So not really attributing it to just a black box, like, architects designed this and therefore, but actually, trying to see, dissect exactly what are the components that make up design. And so we basically came together as a group and we're brainstorming, what are these features, right? And then we really just reflected on our own experience, so we came up with, so in the book, we have 19 features, which we cataloged, and including things like, daylight and views, or like external features like whether a building has a curved, shape either in its footprint or in its facade. Right. We also had things like diagonality, right? Because most office buildings are by default almost like a rectangular footprint. But what if we introduce other angles to it? And then we also had other things like, does the building have a podium? Versus does it have like other kind of zoning induced physical forms like, terraces on the top, which we see a lot of buildings in New York City that's built in the 1920s sharing that feature. So essentially, we went through that exercise and then began to break down design into these measurable features. And then the next step would be, how do we actually measure it, right? Can we measure it with our existing tools and kind of data we have, including the very detailed model that Minkoo was mentioning that New York City has, or do we have to, make additional data sets in order to measure these features which we have identified? And this is kind of, several pieces of research in the book, which essentially came from individual research papers we're trying to do. And speaking of external features, so, like I mentioned, we were looking at curvature or diagonality, zoning setbacks, and podiums. And we actually went into that model and went through every single building. It was a painful exercise. And then basically, like we're marking down, I think in Rhino, there's like a notes section for each individual object. And we were like tagging 1 if a building has this feature and 0 otherwise. And we went through that exercise for the whole every single building in New York City, which, believe it or not, actually took, I think, Tony, how long was it? Like 3 months?
Days and nights.
Yeah, it's
Too
like
long.
a length of time that we don't really want to remember.
Well, you need an architect to do this
listen to
research.
loud music or like put on TV shows and just to, get through it, do the work. And then basically we were using like data methods to essentially run, regression analysis, which can be this foreign term to architects, but essentially like statistical methods to see whether these features, in addition to other attributes we know about the building, actually contributed to, the price of the building. And so, as Minkoo said, in his research where he was looking at the status of awarded design, the answer was yes. Like awarded design compared to non-awarded design has more value. And then it was quite similar for our research with the 4 features I just described, but not everything, right? So diagonality and buildings with podium, they did have a design premium comparing to other buildings which didn't have these features. But surprisingly, buildings with setbacks, so like a wedding cake shaped building on top of a tower, actually reduced the transaction price and the rental price of a building. So that really kind of highlights the question, like this is a design feature. It actually could reduce your value, right? So should we actually build more of this or should we not? And this is a question that we don't really have an answer for. But to kind of, like trying to figure out or to guess why this is, we're thinking that perhaps maybe, because you're taking away essentially rentable, floor space on top of a building where, there's good views on top, but you rent less of it. So that could be the reason why that, a building with these really unique and iconic features actually transact for less, right? And at the same time, it's also not really providing a lot of public amenities that some of the other features, for example, like podiums or diagonal intersections with these kind of bow tie like viewpoints on different kind of streets and plazas are bringing, right? So there is also that debate, like, not only is it, has less rentable square footage, but it's also kind of contributing less kind of public amenities that some of these other features are doing. So this is really something that we could open up the discussion for only after we ran those statistical analysis to see what impact it had. And Tony, you can probably also talk a little bit about like street level greenery and other things that we've done, which were also interesting to kind of add to the discussion.
Totally, but actually, before that, I want to ask, because Alex and Oliva, you both studied architecture before. Did that kind of result actually match your expectation, though? Like our findings. One was setback. I'm not sure if you read the other results. I think the curvature, not curvature. Curvature is not the best example, but diagonality, for example, and also podium have positive premiums. But did that kind of result resonate with what you expected when you were thinking about what kind of design metrics creates?
I just want to clarify. So when you talk about diagonality, are you talking about, like, for instance, the Flatiron building that comes together at a point? Yeah, I think with that, in terms of that, I'm not surprised because I'm pretty sure it's not that great of a building to be in a triangular floor plate, but it's just special, and so it looks iconic and it looks interesting, and it also exists at maybe two important intersections, so Broadway and whatever street that is. With the podium one, I think that sort of makes sense maybe to me because it probably means that there's more public amenities on those podium level, potentially kind of mall or commercial. The one that's interesting to me is the setback one. I think I wouldn't have expected that, but what it makes me think is that setbacks were introduced in New York, actually the first city to introduce this sort of form-based zoning, simply to actually create value for the public, meaning you don't want to create skyscrapers that inhibit light from hitting the street. You want to make sure that the public realm is healthy. And so while there may be a cost associated with it for the building side, I think many would argue that the value is actually more on the public side. And so we had talked about other forms of value, not just financial. And I think this might be one of those cases where actually your research starts to say, okay, how do we balance the values a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it opens up this discussion, it serves the purpose of the book. We have never done this type of research or a statistical analysis on design features. The fact that we've started it adds more question to this question, which then means that, you know, there's something to talk about here.
One thing I'm curious about is like design to a certain extent is fairly subjective. And in the way I feel like you describe some of these characteristics, it's a little bit of a subjective evaluation as well, right? You are going in and manually labeling a lot of these buildings, right? But statistical analysis in itself is kind of an objective measure. So like, how did you guys balance what's a 1 and what's a 0 on the feature? Like, how did you set those thresholds?
Well, I think one way was to define design as not necessarily an aesthetics or personal, because aesthetics can be judged by personal taste and by experience. So I think the design features that Helena mentioned, they're more like very objective features. Like setback is not an aesthetic choice. It's a choice of massing. And it serves, and also the podium, like it's a choice of programmatic use. But those are all incorporated in the design process. It's not just an aesthetical choice that an architect makes. So I think we are more emphasizing the part of the organizational effect in design, the more of a problem-solving attitude of design, rather than on the aesthetical side.
But it's also interesting. I think the other thing that comes to my mind is that a lot of those decisions that you're talking about are not actually decided by the designer. You had mentioned, Helena, that a lot of this is kind of plan based. So if the setbacks are allowed or actually required, also a lot of those decisions end up being made by the owner or the developer. I just can remember circumstances in my life in my career where I was working on something or my team was working on something and the developer said, that's nice, but we can't do it that way. We need to do something totally different. And they actually have the final say on a lot of these things.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point because, you know, Alex, you mentioned a lot of at least the features that we were talking about just now were plan-based, right? It's required by zoning or because that's the way that the building footprint allows it. The plot is like that. But actually what was interesting is even though we bring the examples of, for example, the Flatiron building and others, we noticed that among kind of the entire building stock of Manhattan, like for example, the setbacks were required by law, like the 1920s zoning ordinance, which was actually, you know, they had an update to that in 1960s. There was a zoning resolution which essentially removed that requirement, right? And instead introduced podiums. But we noticed that in the data set that we were working with, there's actually a lot of buildings that still had these setbacks even after the zoning resolution was enacted, which means that at some point or later or more recent history, it was design decisions that was made, you know, either because the developer liked it or the architect was insisting, we don't know, like that's a black box. But what we do know is even though the zoning was no longer required, those were choices that were made by the creators of these buildings. And that was pretty interesting. And I think that's the same thing for diagonality as well, because, you know, most of the buildings that we studied that had the diagonal feature were buildings that were being cut across by the Broadway, this massive kind of diagonal intersection that cuts across the whole city. But there's also other instances where even though a building did have a rectangular footprint, somehow the designer was introducing some sort of, acute or obtuse angles and essentially breaking that regularity. So I think what we're doing with running these statistical analysis is also taking into account of those buildings, right? And even though and what we did find is, it still had an impact. So it kind of, plays on the question of who at the end makes these design decisions, and whether these design decisions had any real tangible impact or like results, for these buildings.
I want to add one quick thought on the diagonality, because the reason why I asked Alex and Lebo, that was kind of intentional. I want to see whether you would see some unexpected, let's say, reasoning behind. Because that was exactly the thought practice we had after we saw the result. And one finding we had, I think it was actually from Andrea, I'm not sure exactly, was because most of diagonality, even though it has weird, let's say, footprint constrained by the plot of the land. But as most time, because of that, there's this kind of diagonal cuts. Most buildings are located in a more right next to probably a wider open space, because of that cut. So it's at that in the intersection. So potentially they have better views, or potentially they have a park next to it. So somehow that there are of course pros and cons, but maybe traffic is bad. So pros and cons add to this kind of decision, to the result. But to really understand, to reason the finding, actually is really the next step that we can advocate everyone to work on.
Yeah, that's super interesting. To finally answer your question, the diagonality does kind of surprise me, because I think there's a balance, right? It's like the location of the building versus the utilization of the building. And when I was at WeWork, I laid out maybe hundreds, thousands of desks across tons of different building shapes. And one thing I hated is laying out desks in a diagonal shaped building, because it's so hard to fit desks in a proper manner in that. And, as you guys probably know, like desk count is probably one of the big core drivers of revenue for a potential office space. If you can fit more desks, you can sell more desks, and you generate more rent. So that's a way that we were kind of evaluated what leases they were willing to take on and things like that. And going back to kind of your point about plans, like plans is one of those major drivers, right? The right shape plan can give you a better layout, can give you kind of more comfortable ways to fit out different folks in that office space.
Yeah, it's also I tend to think of things at a very large scale. And so, Tony, you bring up the parks, but the diagonal results mostly from Broadway, and Broadway is primarily in the middle third of Manhattan too. So it's also has, when you learn about real estate when you're a kid, it's always about location, 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 right? So I feel like it also has these other consequences, which I imagine is really hard to track, sort of what's causality and what's a consequence. But I think that nevertheless, it's really fascinating, because most of design is kind of figuring things out too. There's no hard and clear kind of results.
Yeah, the design is like a question mark. It's a black box. It's the randomness to a project. If everything can be defined, I don't see any value in it. And I think the first thing that we wanted to avoid in the book is to have this read as some sort of a toolkit to appreciate or to build the most highly valued building. That's not the goal. And
you're not making recipes for no.
Okay. We're not projecting anything. We're just looking back and with a question that we all just talked about: does design have a value? And I think our finding actually strengthens the fact that it is a random box, but if you're lucky, you can get a good prize. But what determines that?
It makes sense that we should be more directed, because one of the things that I've always struggled with in my career and I'm trying to kind of respond to is the disconnect between the implementer and the designer, the one who's at the end authorizing the project as well as the one who's saying what the project should be. I think that a lot of times that disconnect comes from a lack of shared values. In the most simple terms, the developer is trying to maximize profit, and the architect is not usually trying to do that. They're trying to do other things. It could be good design, it could be a safe building, it could be a sustainable build. And that if there were more common ground for us to kind of talk across, we could actually probably have better projects.
And actually looking into the financial value helps us to do that, because every profession involved, even on the renter and the buyer side, the same currency is the financial value.
Yeah, currency, that's the word.
Yeah. It's the common word that everyone uses and understands. So I think it has a meaning to try to see what the value of design is through that lens, so that everyone can at least can understand that, oh, there is something there.
Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating too, because I'm starting to now think about the city and how increasingly cities are doing public-private partnerships to actually do large-scale projects. So it's not just the developer that's going to have a stake in this. It's the city itself, because, well, also it's usually tax revenue for the city. So the better a project performs, the more the city can take away from it. Do you have any kind of perspectives from the more public-facing side of things, either the city, the officials, or just people in general who go about the space? How should they interpret some of your findings?
I think one research in particular can add to that is we have a study on the street level greenery and how that actually affects the pricing of real estate. So, and the result we found was basically different levels of presence of the greenery on the streets right next to a building would help create a premium for the price, both the rental price and also transaction price. So, sorry about that. I guess the key point here is that aligns the interest between developers and the public agencies, authorities, and also the designers. Because by having more greenery right next to the building is a public amenity, but it's also potentially amenity for the property owner in that regard. Because in New York, we know it's not just the city taking care of the streetscape. I think they're private. One is a business improvement districts. They also take care of a streetscape, and sometimes I think developers or property management companies, they take care of this kind of public private gardens. So all those things actually, if we agree on that the value of street level greenery, which is a common urban design feature, then we actually bring a lot of people onto the table and then align their opinions.
Yeah, and wouldn't you think that's even more important post-COVID than before?
Oh, that totally, and that also brings more, probably more interest into, let's say, shared public space inside the building, or let's say the inclusion of balcony, which would be more important.
That makes me think about the Seagram Tower. Like, that was the first building that proposed an open plaza to give certain part of the private land to the public to use it as public space. And well, Seagram building was actually dealt as an anomaly, because that building's value was like skyrocketing comparing to the others. Like, the premium involved in that building was skyrocketing. Maybe because of the time that it was built there, maybe the address on Park Avenue, maybe the cachet that Mies van der Rohe carries. But that building had like a very explosive premium related to the design side. And it also was influential in city policy, because after that building, the city gave FAR bonuses if the project kind of mimicked that gesture by giving their private property to the public to have more gardens and street greenery like that. And in fact, what Tony is suggesting is, in our research, it turns out that there is also associated real estate premium associated to that feature. So I think that's the interesting kind of circle that we are identifying through this research.
So I guess this research was initially motivated in part by your role as designers from kind of designer perspective. So now, having gone through this years of research, knowing what you know now, what's your advice or what should designers learn from your book?
That's a challenging question. I think the 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 first step is we made it clear, or at least we provided some evidence to onto the table that design has intrinsic values. So so there will be two benefits, I would say. First is we provide more understandings of design. So before the discussion about design focused probably more on aesthetics or certain criteria established in the discipline. So it's in a way somehow difficult for the public to understand. So now we actually provide another perspective to understand design, and we provide evidence. Then second point is exactly because we provide evidence, now it has more opportunity for design to be understood by the public and also other professionals. So in that way, we might see more communications, engagements happening across disciplines and also professions.
Yeah, I can add to that. So I think, as you mentioned, Tony, a key word here is evidence. And I think so much decision making these days, like it's all evidence based, right? We make design decisions or other financial decisions based on what we know in the past has been successful. And I think one of the key arguments we have in this book is, design sometimes is sidelined, or it's kind of this nice to have but not a must have in the past because it didn't have evidence, right? So what we're trying to do here is, by creating this research, not necessarily as a didactic piece, like you have to have your building have all these features in order to make it right, but instead is to really try to have more power given back to the designer at the negotiations table, because we know as architects sometimes our designs are rejected by our clients because it's too expensive, right? Like good design sometimes is associated with high cost, and this cost is upfront cost, and there's hesitation to make these decisions on the part of the developers because they don't know what's going to happen after they make these upfront cost payment at the beginning during construction. So we are essentially trying to, provide this foundation of knowledge to see so what has design contributed in the past? What can we learn from it? And hopefully that, would in some ways align incentives or, bridge gaps between these different stakeholders. But as we've also seen, for example, with the zoning setback example, sometimes there's not going to be like a happy solution, right? Like you either have this or you don't have some other things. So I think that is also valuable because it opens up the debate, right? To what extent can we allow for these, losses in values that might manifest as values in some other areas. For example, introducing more light versus not having enough, rentable square footage. And I think, as we mentioned here, that, sometimes the city, the public are also stakeholders that are brought into the scene. So that also makes it a more rich discussion, right? Like, do we only strive for financial value, or do we kind of understand value more holistically and try to make different trade-offs? And that's something that we don't have answers for necessarily, but hopefully this book opens up that discussion and contributes to it also.
Well, I think it really underscores the fact that the general city is contested, meaning there are lots of actors within it that have their own different values, their own different aspirations. And a lot of times it comes down to who can use their resources or use their leverage to get their way. I think it's interesting you use money because that's usually what it comes down to, who has financial resources to get stuff done, which doesn't mean this isn't always the right way to do things, but at least creating some sort of currency and saying, okay, at least I can advocate for something, knowing how much it's going to cost, or what the sort of a premium would be on that. It's completely fascinating. And I think it's really something that is tough because it's such a large realm that you're dealing with. I mean, you're just dealing with Manhattan, not even the entire city. And there's all different cities around the world that have their own values, their own cultures and societies. So I'm sure you would come up with certain things that are similar, but probably things that also refute some of the outcomes of this research. But no, it is completely fascinating, because I do think that there's just a lack of decision-making direction. And a lot of what we do when it comes to built environment is just sort of trying things out, but we can only try once. And so we might as well learn from it, right?
Yeah, I think the book also suggests or opens up an opportunity for even developers to think about a different way of working with designers and architects, because if it adds value and if it's undefined, for me, it's added risk, but it's also added opportunity. They are already, of course, if you're thinking like there are already like super tall high rises designed by all these famous fancy architects that are selling for like billions of dollars, millions of dollars. That could be one way, but I think there are many other ways to utilize design or design thinking to make your project better. So I think this book actually suggests that. And when you think about the majority of the realistic development practice, it actually the book talks about it. It came from like 1918, since the first tower that was developed by an insurance company. So the way that the insurance, the Equitable Life building, the insurance companies came up with a way. They did a tour. They went to Chicago. They saw the first high-rise building with and then they looked at an elevator, and then they tried to bring it here. They already had all their calculations in place in terms of how much space they need for themselves, and also how much to rent. And then they hired an architect. They actually held a competition inviting like 5 architecture firms, but giving a quite strict guideline. And this was like 1918. It sounds damn similar to how it's working now, right? So I think it is time for us to think about a different way of building in the cities. And for sure, there are many different things that we can achieve if we try to, if we at least try to start thinking about them. Like, I don't know what it can be, but sustainability can be one thing. If you can commit to a certain value that you think is important, a developer or whoever is initiating that project has the ability to find the right team and execute it. So.
No, it's wonderful, and I am personally looking forward to the book coming out. Can you guys let us know when we can anticipate the release?
End of this year.
It'll be in bookstores end of this year, published by Oro and the graphic designer Studio Lin. Stay tuned, everyone.
Okay, well, we'll make sure to.
Our editor, Julia Vanderhoo, who has been working with us from the beginning.
From Original Copy, based in Brooklyn.
Well, I think it would be fascinating to put this in the hands of developers, planners, architects, landscape architects, and also the general public, and get their reaction, because it's a topic that seems so simple but so complex at the same time. I think that you would probably find that people have different values when it comes to design. Hopefully there can be some consensus that's reached. I hope that it's something that people start to question a little bit more about too. So with that, I would encourage people who are listening to read. I think it would be really helpful if people could reach out to you. So we'll make sure to include your contact information in the podcast links. But to be honest, guys, this has been a really fascinating conversation about, the value of design. I think there's a lot of different ways that I'm going to go look out into the world and see how these things play out. But I also think that it's a wonderful way to start a conversation that probably doesn't end here, and it's going to continue with our careers and the careers of many others as well. So thank you so much for that. And with that, this has been another episode of Most Podern. Thanks to our guests, Helena, Tony, and Minkoo, sort of. But stay tuned for more episodes, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.